Thanks for logging on today and hanging out with us to learn a little bit about pathways towards regenerative cannabis. I'm going to do a short welcome and then I'll toss off in our Cannabis Sustainability Symposium. It's presented by the Cannabis Certification Council, and this is the 5th year. A little bit in the past years, this year we actually have like 130 speakers and 45 panels because we had to innovate and adjust. So just a little bit about sustainability in the cannabis industry. Even though a year feels like 10 years to a lot of people in the industry, we are still a very new and nascent industry. So we have to just build sustainability into the growing cannabis industry. And there's so much opportunity for innovation, and it's really, really cool that we get to learn about one of those innovations right now. So let me read the description. While there is no universally accepted standard for regenerative agriculture, companies ranging from Cargill to Patagonia are touting commitments to regenerative production. Philosophically, regenerative agriculture improves soil health rather than just maintaining it. So it can be thought of a bar above sustainable, really. Regenerative agriculture practices include cover cropping, intensifying and lengthening crop rotations, and reducing tillage. These practices generally function to build up soil by increasing the amount of living plant cover in photosynthesis or atmospheric carbon capture, as well as decreasing soil disturbance, which increases the soil loss, carbon loss, via microbial respiration. These practices can help improve the carbon balance of row crop agriculture relative to the prevailing systems, where 1 or 2 crop grain systems dominate and cover crop adoption. While increasing is still quite limited, less than 5% of cropland acres nationally, building soil is not just about carbon. Ancillary benefits of this include improving crop resilience to drought, extreme rainfall, and in some cases. Together, this approach to growing holds much promise for the cannabis industry and other crop users interested in for plants, people, and the planet. And I will toss it over to our moderator, Jake Polser.
Nice. Hello, everyone. Super excited to be moderating and chiming in on this great Pathways to Regenerative panel. So I'm Jacob Politzer, the co-founder and director of science and strategy for the Cannabis Conservancy and co-founder and board chair of Sun and Earth Certified, a regenerative cannabis certification. So now I'm going to introduce each of our panels. It looks like one of our panelists is running a bit late, so bear with us. But to introduce first, we have Allison Grantham, who is the principal of Goodwell Consulting. So I'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Allison, and I run GrowWell, a consulting firm dedicated to advancing sustainable and regenerative food and agriculture. I have a PhD in ecology and biogeochemistry from Penn State, where I worked on the climate agriculture interactions and specifically focused on nitrogen. And professionally, prior to starting my practice last year, I ran food procurement and sustainability for Blue Apron, the national meal kit company, as well as worked for Penn State Extension and ran research at the Rodale Institute, Organic and Regenerative Agriculture Institute in Eastern Pennsylvania.
Nice. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to have you here. Our next panelist, Yuko Ono, is the founder of EOS Farms. I'd like to give a brief introduction.
Yes, thank you, Jacob. So my name is Suehiko Ono, and as Jacob said, I'm one of the co-founders of EOS Farm, and we are an organization that kind of came into the Massachusetts industry, cannabis industry, adult use. So very mission-driven, if you will. Our goal is to connect the the emerging cannabis adult use industry with small local farms in the state of Massachusetts and then potentially through the Northeast. I have somewhat of a circuitous route of how I got here. I've somewhat been, I guess you could say, all over the place and inadvertently been grooming myself to do this. But I spent 2 years, got into agriculture, living at a Zen monastery outside of California, or excuse me, outside of San Francisco, Green Gulch Farm. Some of you may have heard of it. It was one of the early CCOF certified organic farms. From there, went to UC Santa Cruz and studied at their agroecology program. From there, went to New York and developed a small CSA farm for a nonprofit in Ossining, New York. From there, took a sharp left turn or right turn, however you might phrase it, went to law school, became a corporate tax attorney for a very short and painful career. And from there, went out to Sedona, Arizona to study martial arts for the past 10 years. And since then, you know, I've always had this vision, this hope, dream, if you will, of connecting, or let me back up and say, finding creative ways to support small, local, sustainable, and as the term is now, regenerative farms. When the adult use regs were promulgated, the draft regs came out for Massachusetts in, I believe, November of 17. And I've been looking at all adult use and recreational regulations as they've come out across the country. And Massachusetts, with the background and the already existing support for small farms, with the regs as they were written, presented this opportunity. So I've been out now back in Massachusetts since June of 18. And we had our last post-provisional inspection by the Cannabis Control Commission 2 days ago. And so we are expected to be licensed for cultivation outdoor as well as indoor greenhouse in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, hopefully very, very soon, knock on wood.
Nice. Thank you so much. Super excited to have you and have your insight into the topics today. So hopefully Ross Bayal will join. He co-founded Cannabis out in Jamaica. Brings a super interesting perspective to a discussion. So how we're going to do the panel today is I'm going to ask each panelist a question that we decided on earlier that kind of looks at different aspects of pathways to regenerative agriculture and cannabis regenerative agriculture, kind of looking at the environmental, the kind of economics business case, the spiritual case for it. And then we're going to kind of end with a bit of a social community empowerment aspect. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat panel. I'll be looking at that throughout the panel, and then I'll gently interrupt at opportune times to pose those questions to our panelists. And if it's something easy that I can answer, more than happy to do that. And so to kind of start this panel off, Allison, first question is for you. And I'd say, like, from an ecological perspective, since that is your background, you know, why is regenerative agriculture so important? And I guess, like, what systems, you know, can a cannabis farmer most benefit from when pursuing regenerative practices?
Yeah, so regenerative agriculture, as you know, we talked about in the session description, is all about biointensification. So building resilience in your crop production system, resilience to pests, resilience to disease, internal closed loop type of nutrient cycling so that you can provide for the needs of the plant without importing synthetic fertilizers to a greater extent. Those are sort of the key attributes of a regenerative system. And so that system has benefits for all types of crops and for within the cropping system and then on the broader landscape. So our current cropping systems are very limited in their diversity and in their adoption of regenerative practices like cover cropping or organic nutrient use. So cannabis production, particularly outdoor cannabis production. I think we should probably mention that regenerative is all about soil and being grown in the dirt. So that's the first piece, is a way that can offer some benefits to the landscape and to the society in terms of improving carbon capture and mitigating climate change, but also improving the resilience of cropping systems to continue to produce and be functional as we face more of these, high temperatures, droughts, extreme rainfall events. So it's not just about mitigation, it's also about adaptation. So it can help in that way. And then using rotational diversity to help manage pest and disease cycles is a way that we can reduce the need for the pesticides that certification is trying to move us away from. And so in that way, using competition and the just natural ecological interactions between the cropping systems to break up those pest cycles and mitigate pest pressure without using inputs. So in that way, you can create a product that is cleaner and better for the end consumer, as well as all of the plants, animals, waterways that are connected to the production system.
Yeah, no, great. Sihiko, would you like to add a bit on that from your perspective?
I think Allison did a fantastic job of sort of outlining the general principles. It's very much a working term of art that's being developed and better understood. But essentially just that integration of the natural ecology. So it's very much, there's of course very good hard science behind it, biology and what have you, but it's very much an art, and it requires an intimate understanding of the specific ecosystem and microclimate and all the different factors on every individual farm. So it's quite a beautiful art, like I said, and really the approach to not just, there's two sides to it, of course, and which I think are integrated and connected, but there's the ecological, if you will, and the economic. And so the economic benefits of being ecological is that your costs are reduced, often quite significantly.
I agree. I like to always think about it as like regenerative practice, like working with nature rather than against it, and using the bounty and the systems and the cycles to work in favor of what you're doing, which kind of, Allison pointed out with the like reducing pest pressures, biodiversity, like nature abhors a vacuum. And so if it's filled with, a lot of biodiversity on all levels, soil, crops, insects, you're not going to have these, massive outbreaks that we tend to see in indoor grows, where then they have to reach towards, some kind of pesticide. So definitely. And just a reminder, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. It's rare we get such great experts in one place. So, please feel free to use it to your advantage. So I guess moving on, Sihiko, this is for you, talking kind of about, the business case, since you are, have started a new farm taking on regenerative practices. So for you, what was kind of the case for growing cannabis regeneratively? Like, why did you decide to, incorporate regenerative practices into your new cannabis cultivation, as opposed to, a more conventional or indoor style?
Sure. I guess I'd say I'd back up first a few steps and say, and I mentioned this a little bit, the interest to me is food production, right? And not just commodity crops, but growing sustenance for local communities. The term now often used, food security, if you will. And from that standpoint, the reintegration of externalities, right? That term of art, meaning when incumbent industry can pollute with impunity, and everyone else pays the cost in the environment. And these things have always, these have been at the fore of a lot of conversations around organic agriculture. But one of the underlying challenges is when a small, organic, sustainable, regenerative farm is trying to compete in a global market, in a landscape where we're talking tens of billions of dollars of direct federal and often state subsidy to large commodity crops, often primarily at this stage corn for sugar, causing potentially all kinds of epidemics and obesity and metabolic syndrome and what have you. And so from there, the question has always been for me, how do you support small local farms? When I was started working on a farm at a Zen monastery, the way to subsidize farms, and this is still largely true, and I try to put these in terms that aren't offensive to anyone, but it was very, very important to convince young idealists that it's good for their soul to work on a farm for free, and that's how you subsidize it. In our case, it was Zen monastic ideology, which allowed us to again work for our soul for free and subsidize farms. And that model still plays out and still works, but I've been interested in finding more sustainable, if you will, models and connecting industries that are high value crops like cannabis was a natural solution in that regard. So fast forward, why regenerative? Well, again, for lack of a better term, the spiritual purposes, but if you go straight to the economics, as it stands currently, if you look at the landscape of cultivation licenses and potential licenses in the state of Massachusetts, all of the smart money, if you will, and I use the term smart money extremely loosely, but there is this convinced meme / echo chamber belief that you cannot grow a plant outside, which seems to me a little bit crazy. But what happened ultimately was that people forgot how this plant got inside. And very simply put, the reason the plant is inside is helicopters, right? Not because of the biology or physiology of the plant, but because you had to hide from law enforcement. And so for the longest time, this was grown inside closets and became very sophisticated because the profit margins were extraordinary and energy use was not a concern other than, again, hiding it from law enforcement. But the smart money, as they're called, forgot to go back to first principles, and that's what we decided to do. And the light bulb went off and said, "Aha! You can grow a plant outside." And lo and behold, it turns out, shockingly, you can grow a plant outside. Now, back to the ecological and economic aspect of it. Right now, the name of the game for the smart money, if you look at the capital expenditure to build an indoor grow facility, you're looking at about $1,000 to $2,000 per square foot. And I encourage anyone to challenge me or research these statements. Very, very easy to justify, but $1,000 to $2,000 a square foot, if you start doing the math on that, the largest canopy that you can own in the state of Massachusetts is 100,000 square foot. So if you were to build 100,000 square foot at the average cost to build out an indoor facility, that's about $100 million. 100,000 square foot is 2.3 acres. So for the cost of security, which is extensive, and the cost of a fence, you can do the same thing. And so the idea being, instead of playing the game of time the market, which is essentially what you're doing if you build out a $100 million square foot facility, you are hoping to get a return on your investment before market saturation and the price drops, which inevitably is going to happen. And everyone who jumps in here knows that that is the case. But again, the game they're playing is time the market, right? So they start with this first principle: you can't grow this plant outside. It's somehow biologically impossible. At least that's what their spreadsheets tell them. And so from there, you build it out and just pray that either you get your money back because you have enough time before market saturation hits, or you exit your investment, right? So it's a financial deal. So from that standpoint, we said, let's just go back and grow a plant as it has been for hundreds of thousands of years. And from there, we were one of, I think, 2 applicants when we started, and now it turns out, you can grow outside. People have seen it. And so there's, I think, 7 or 8 additional applicants, including 6 outdoor cultivators. So the landscape is changing, still not very much. There's about 50 cultivators licensed with final license, plant touching licenses in the state. But the economics play out quite well. And of course, all these questions of sustainability. Often you hear conversations in sustainability, symposiums and what have you. And the conversation is around, how do I get a more efficient light bulb, right, for my indoor grow, and, more sustainable solar panels or what have you. Whereas if you go directly to the sun and use regenerative practices, then you've cracked that nut almost immediately.
Thank you for that. Allison, do you have anything to add to that from your perspective?
Yeah, I think this whole concept of the carbon balance is really central to what regenerative agriculture is. And, with photosynthesis and carbon capture by plants being sort of the core magic that we are recognizing and appreciating in regenerative agriculture. And so that works when the plant is outside capturing free solar energy and turning it into carbon in its leaves and shoots and roots, and ultimately putting that into the soil and building the carbon in the soil so that it has effectively moved it from the atmosphere to the earth. And so that has, as Suihiko was saying, the energy cost of artificially trying to do that doesn't matter if you're using LEDs. An LED versus the sunshine is always going to be a losing economic proposition. But I think it's also important to note that it's a losing ecological or environmental proposition as well. Regardless of whether you're using solar energy or not, you are going to need to have a larger area covered in solar panels to capture enough, with all of the losses with transmission and conversion into lighting, to fuel the area where you would be growing plants. And so it's much, there isn't really a way to short circuit it and have the same type of positive carbon balance. You're going to be emitting more than your plants can capture if you are supplying light energy with electricity and not the sun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so a couple of things that kind of came up for me, so when you started this, was kind of with the economics case and like the diversity in crop production and food scarcity. Just as we work with between Sun and Earth Certified and the Cannabis Conservancy, at this point over 60 farms across North America. And what we've really seen, especially since the COVID-19 started, was because they also grow food, a lot of them manage CSAs or do local farmers markets, that's been really helping them economically survive. That's actually been a huge boost to their bottom lines, because everyone's trying to, especially when scarcity was hitting all of the grocery stores and supply chains were getting interrupted, was really becoming a huge part of their bottom line, besides just growing cannabis. And so the diversity, and I think it's another kind of economic justification for that. So I did want to point that out, that there's a huge demand these days for locally grown, regenerative organic produce, so there is kind of that market that's demanding it. If you grow it, they will buy it for sure. And then I guess playing devil's advocate a little bit, because I do hear this quite a lot, is when talking about outdoor growing, we can't get crop insurance for cannabis at this moment for outdoor. I believe in 2021, hemp will have access to kind of the federal farmer insurance program because of the farm bill, but it is a liability. You are at the whims of nature. So how do you kind of mitigate that risk or kind of justify that risk? So you go ask you first, and then Allison, I'd love for you to respond.
Sure. So, the risk landscape is definitely different, and I won't say blanket that, there is no risk, but anytime you have an agricultural crop, whether it's indoor, outdoor, controlled or not, lab coats or not, there's risk. That's just the nature of it. And forgive me, I forget whether it was you, Jacob, or Allison who talked about this, but nature abhors a desert. And so when you create an internal desert, a landscape that is a monocrop, then you're selecting, an environment and a habitat for imbalance, let's just say. Now, that said, go back to what I said. There's two major costs that you have to consider, right? In any business, you've got the initial capital expenditure to build it out, right? All that infrastructure, and then you got the operating costs every year. Well, if I'm building out, okay, so let's say I don't have crop insurance, and that's my biggest concern, and we're playing devil's advocate here, Jacob. So if it costs me $1,000 a square foot to build out, and again, let's say I only build out 10,000 square foot, right? That's $10 million. $10 million to build out an indoor grow facility. Then, depending on how the incentives are working to lie at that point, and who's lying about what, the cost of goods sold for an indoor crop, when you talk about all the electricity that Allison brought up, you're looking at $1.50 to $4.50, again, depending on how much we're lying in this scenario, to per gram to produce. Okay, so we're going to be outside. We're not $1,000 a square foot. We're $35 a square foot. $35 a square foot capital expenditure to build it out. Then it's going to cost us, instead of $1.50 to $4.50 a gram, somewhere between 50 cents and 75 cents a gram to produce. So what that means is we can take that $10 million, we'll take 1 million of that, and we'll self-insure.
Yeah, thank you. Allison, would you like to answer? And then we do have our first question.
Yeah, so I, come from the agronomic crop world. So the economics there are quite different, but the strategies that are available for mitigating risk, mitigating risk from excess moisture in the spring or insufficient moisture during the summer, during the growing season, those strategies transfer. And one of the primary means of mitigating that is through growing winter cover crops, which as a practice, I was just doing some work for another client that's interested in carbon markets, and we're looking at, somewhere in the neighborhood of around $40 an acre to all in cost for seed, labor, drilling, et cetera, for establishing and terminating a cover crop. So that is very cheap when you, in the context of other production costs. And it's a little bit more expensive to grow a nitrogen fixing cover crop to provide the nutrients that the subsequent crop would need, but that's another strategy that you can use, and you're still looking at under $100 an acre to add that type of resilience to your system, and also remove the cost of purchasing fertilizer, so you can basically pay for the practice in cost savings in another area.
Thank you. So, and I would also say, too, is what we're finding is, if you're growing outdoors, so I'm based in Denver, most of our cultivation, we're all over coast to coast, but is diversifying genetics, and especially heritage strains and strains that have been bred for your climate. Like we, for the, Rockies, with a lot of our grows that are always concerned about hail, early frost. I mean, we had, inches dumped on us in, when was that? August, I want to say, I can't remember, but of just quick ripening varieties, breeding in kind of Alaskan Thunderfuck was a big one, because it's a very early short season variety, but focusing on breeding, and which kind of leads to this first question. So our biggest hurdle to growing outside is pollen and quality variability. Any thoughts on overcoming these obstacles? So pollen is always a very tricky one. What we always look at, coming back from my days as like an organic certifier, we look at like pesticide drift, which is kind of similar. Because it can also travel for miles in the air, is know your neighbors, get good relationships with your neighbors, educate your neighbors, etc. It is a big issue, especially as more conventional farmers come into, especially the hemp space, and not really understanding the plant physiology. And so that's my first comment on that. And then as far as quality variability, I think it also goes back to like my first answer here is genetics. And what we're seeing with our farmers is, yes, you want to grow strains that are going to be economically, in demand. But also, you do 50% that, and then 50% what grows well in your area, and that will help with the quality variability, like plants that thrive within your specific microclimate. But it is like a journey, and either breed yourself or, a lot of times you need to find a breeder. But those are my initial thoughts. I'd like to open it up to Allison and Suiko.
I can talk a little bit about the pollen drift from the perspective. I mean, that's always an issue in agronomic crops too, particularly corn, where the pollen can drift. So there's a couple of strategies that you can use. One of them is planting date, and this is commonly used in corn systems where you stagger your planting, and organic farmers often are planting a couple weeks later, so that the pollen drift is not happening at the same time as their conventional neighbors. And then another strategy is the sort of like a trap crop or a buffer crop. Planting a crop that's a little bit earlier, that's going to be a little bit taller and catch more of that pollen drift around the outside of your field, and then not harvesting that for your market. So those are strategies that are used in corn systems to avoid contamination with GE pollen.
Nice, yeah. And I also think it's a great opportunity to have an environmental easement, buffer barriers on your farm, and create a wild land, beneficial insectary, and ideally, have a nice windbreak that will ideally capture that as well. Suiko?
Yeah, I second all of those. The physical barriers, the the biological and physical barriers. The thing that I would add, Jacob, you mentioned this, but really kind of bolster this is, I think an important aspect of this, as both the cannabis, in particular, if outdoor happens, as well as the hemp industries in Massachusetts and the Northeast grow, is coordination, right? Business associations, farmers associations, education. Even a hemp grower is going to ideally want feminized seeds. And so there's going to be hopefully not so much by way of pollen. That said, all kinds of environmental and other stressors can cause flip, and, hermaphrodites and all kinds of things can happen anyway. So that's, again, where coordinated efforts, being careful about where particular crops, and this is where potentially municipalities can get involved and limit specific crops to various areas with participation and coordinated efforts with growers. But I think that communication is absolutely crucial. Is social cooperation, the human effort. Without that, it could be a significant issue. As it stands now, it's very difficult to get a license anyway, and again, hemp is really going to be our biggest concern. We're addressing it with, again, physical and biological barriers, and really just doing everything we can to help reach out and encourage people to use good practices and get feminized seeds and what have you.
Yeah, and I mean, this is just me thinking off the cuff a bit in relation to this, but I mean, I think part of it is also knowing your neighbors before buying a property. If you're looking at something and seeing what's going on, especially if you're going the regenerative organic route, you don't want to be in the middle of vineyards or, conventional soy, kind of understanding that and mitigating it that way. Granted, if you're already established and a hemp farm comes in next door, you're not just going to pack up and move. But then also, potentially autoflower because they're a lot shorter. And so ideally windrows might be a little bit more effective. And then I think leading into our next question, since Ross Bial is not here yet, is, I think it's a good opportunity. We're seeing a lot of it in California with like appellations, but, regenerative practices is not just agricultural practices. I think us as on this panel really look at it as having a workers' rights and a community engagement, community empowerment component to it. And I think that there is definitely opportunity to develop kind of community or watershed or local regional best practices that will help to mitigate this, because it can be a massive economic burden is getting your crop seeded and then having it all go to oil or something like that when you're expecting to sell AAA rated flour. But there's, I think, opportunities to bring your community together to agree upon a set of practices to kind of mitigate some of these risks. It's probably a longer term solution, but I think it's in line with kind of being a regenerative farmer. And so we were going to have Ross Bial talk about kind of he is a Rastafarian Jamaican who works a lot with kind of the indigenous peoples of the island, and really bringing in a very powerful, inspirational message on why he is a regenerative farmer and kind of what that means to him. But I don't want to speak on behalf of him. So I will just wanted to share, because I didn't want it to go kind of unnoticed, but really that cannabis is a very sacred herb. It's the basis of this entire industry. And is an opportunity for us to pay homage and learn, I think, from the indigenous practices that have come before us that are very in line with regenerative practices, can have a foundation there, but as well as it makes us look at building relationships and seeing the cycles. And so to kind of move towards our next question I have for the panelists is really from a regenerative cannabis, farming perspective, and looking at kind of the community empowerment perspective, how do you see the community benefiting from regenerative cannabis cultivation? So Hiko, I'll kind of have you answer this first, and then go to Allison.
Sure. Not to just keep beating this drum, but the inclusion of small local farms, I think one of the conversations on national level about organic versus conventional farming is this, production per square foot, which I take to be completely a red herring, right? And the reason I say that, about 30 to 40% of all the food we produce is wasted, lost along the distribution supply chain. And so really the issue is more an issue of distribution, harvest and distribution and access than it really is about production per square foot. Now, arguments can be made that, total production of, let's call it usable product is higher in a regenerative system, but that's a whole nother discussion. So if we just take it at face value, one of the things that tends to happen, and it's just a natural common sense result of having local farms, is there is food available. And lo and behold, someone took the time to do the research, where it turns out that if you have access to more healthy food, then you tend to eat more healthy food. Also water is wet, in case anyone didn't know that. So point being, just by nature of having farms in a local community, then, essentially the end result is this, again, for lack of a better term, food security. People have access and there is surplus, and, as long as they are there, then the benefits arise. And then, of course, the integration of regenerative and biodiversity and all these other things that we're talking about is sort of a natural windfall. Again, not because it's not doing harm, but as Allison has so eloquently pointed out, it's actually sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere and having a net positive gain, not to mention the aesthetic quality that comes with a nice biodiverse, beautiful farm. So I take those benefits to be just sort of the natural outcome of the presence of local farms.
Allison, your take?
Yeah, so I see a couple of sort of opportunities here. I think one of them that Suhiko has talked about is the role of cannabis in providing profitability and helping to fund diversified farms. So with that, you know, regenerative is not just about, you can't have a regenerative crop that's not grown with other stuff. It's about having a whole system. Cannabis can contribute to that system in being more profitable than some of the other things, but help make the whole, you know, system operate in the black. I think it also, you know, regenerative agriculture and the interest in regenerative agriculture exists because there's a legacy, right, of poor soil management in the United States, and we have, and around the world, but particularly here where we, you know, tilled up a lot of ground and lost a lot of carbon out of the soil with poor management practices, and we have sort of a debt or a hole that we can refill, and that exists now, and you know, you can turn that glass half full and half empty or whatever, you get what I'm saying. And so there's also, I think, the same thing in or an analogous situation with how we have managed cannabis and criminalized it and created a social debt that has, you know, been unequally borne across our society, resulted in you know, very high incarceration rates and you know, basically unequal sort of enforcement that has impoverished some communities. And I think with the legalization of cannabis, there is an opportunity for profits from cannabis to help restore some of that economic imbalance that exists currently, just as we have an opportunity with regenerative agriculture to restore soils. So as we think about, you know, who gets permits and who can set up operations, making sure that that historic legacy is taken into account from a social and an economic perspective, just as we have the situation you know, with soil carbon. I think there's some parallels there that we could manage towards to get a system that regenerates not just soil, but also community, economic, and social health.
Yeah, and just to kind of expand upon that with like the rejuvenating of impoverished communities, you know, a couple of things that kind of come to mind is one is kind of going with the business case that Suhiko, you know, talked about earlier is there's not such a financial barrier, so it does open it up to a broader audience or a broader, you know, farmers. And I also think it's, you know, the basis of regenerative agriculture, regenerating, you know, the planet, your area, that you can do it in an urban landscape and don't necessarily need access or have to move to a very rural or peri-urban environment, that you can take over, you know, abandoned lots and start to do this and really enrich your community. I think there's a lot of benefits from having these, you know, urban gardens, community, you know, food areas. You know, it increases property values, reduces stress, lowers the ambient temperature. I mean, there's so many additional benefits. And then also kind of pointing out is, you know, especially in the United States, but I think worldwide, you know, our food system is reliant on, you know, our elders. You know, it's a very older population that is, you know, kind of integral to the farming practices. And I see the cannabis and hemp industry. I mean, we are the world's newest farmers. And on some level, it's an obligation we have to feed the world and do it more responsibly. And I think it's a big opportunity for that. And then with having a diverse crop production comes the opportunity to spin off a lot of micro enterprises within the community and provide jobs that people can learn on the job. This is going to be transportation, storage, value-added product processing. All of these cottage industries that can stem from one farm and can enrich an entire community. And so I think that looking at it from that point, kind of changes the business scale and justifies a move away from large 1,000-acre multi-combine monoculture. And so it looks like we have about 9 minutes left on this panel. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'm just gonna keep on with this conversation with our esteemed guests. So I'll keep an eye out on the Q&A page or the Zoom chat. But I guess while we have this time, I'd love to leave the audience with some practical regenerative aspects. One thing that's been of interest to me a lot recently is the intercropping and figuring out how that works in the best way, realizing that by intercropping plants, and if not done appropriately, then you are essentially taking away nutrients and water from your main product from the cannabis plant. But I've seen just remarkable intercropping examples, especially these days with a lot of beneficial flowers, and anecdotal at this point, but benefits of showing an increase in resin production and oil, specifically with like psyllium and now I'm blanking on what we're seeing, but of using that to the benefit. So Allison, I'm sure you've got a vast knowledge on this, but to give some practical advice to the audience would be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's, a lot of the intercropping strategies that have been deployed in orchard cropping systems, as well as sort of other annual specialty crop systems could be good analogs. So in those systems, that sort of potential for competition is managed by separating either the time and or the space in which the other crop is grown. So, focusing on growing winter annual crops that are going to be, have complementarity there, or, in the row spaces. So making sure that there is sufficient spatial separation. And of course, this is going to vary depending on whether you're in an arid or semi-arid, or some places like the Northeast, you want to soak up as much of that water as possible, so it's not going to be as much of a concern. But crops like deep tap-rooted crops, like particularly mustard family, things have shown great potential for both bringing up those soil minerals that are deep in the subsoil, and then making them more available to your main crop, as well as they produce a lot of compounds that act as natural fumigants. So if you have disease pressure that needs to be managed, soil-borne issues, they're really helpful. And there are many varieties that are winter hardy in most of the US, or are winter killed. So they will grow until you get a super hard frost, and then they die and break down and provide that soil fumigation benefit. So those have worked quite well, as have cereal grain crops that have 6 feet of fibrous root mass that goes down. And also helps pull up those soil minerals and improves the compounds in the cash crop.
We're seeing a lot of farmers use like daikon radish really break up, especially with clay soils. And chamomile for companion planting is chamomile, psyllium, and a bunch of those different flowers are seeing a nice one with all the beneficials it attracts, but also with an increase in terpene kind of oil production. Oh, we got Roz, I think. Okay. Well, we've got 5 minutes left, unfortunately, but would you like to introduce yourself and kind of briefly discuss like the spirituality that brought you to regenerative farming?
Oh, well, it seems that the time is kind of difficult, you know, and our time. So, you know, well, I am Russ Bayer. You know, I'm sorry to not being here before, but I am a member of the Rastafari community, president of the Kanakyo Rastafari Sanctuary, a firm supporter of international legalization of cannabis. We plant sacramental cannabis for the needs of our community. And I am inspired by the dynamic four-dimensional healing power of ganja, which is a pathway towards regenerative cannabis growing.
Nice. And so I guess I'll ask you this question and we'll end it on this. How does your spirituality really influence your regenerative agriculture philosophy, and really how do you honor the plants and your community through your regenerative practices?
Well, my regenerative philosophy goes hand in hand with my spirituality. Spirituality to me is creating an understanding with the inner self to connect us with our journey of our ancestors and creating a guide for generations to come. I use the herb to meditate for that deeper spiritual connection. And to reach these heights of meditation, we need natural meditative stimulants in order to see clear how our ancestors bonded with nature and how we in this time will prepare food, medicine, and meditation for those coming generations. Now, think of what makes the plant grow. Natural ions, proteins, amino acids, fungi, bacteria, and a pH balance. With basic understanding of regenerative practices, we can make plant grow to achieve their best. Natural composting, harvesting biomass for soil regeneration, making compost, tea for microbial regeneration. And we honor our plant in this time by keeping the ancient organic growing practices, like harnessing decay plants, you know, creating compost and these things. Using it as our spiritual sacrament, like that of most indigenous users of the herb from, you know, across the world. You know, the indigenous people use different herbs for their sacramental uses. But we use cannabis as Rastafarian people. We use cannabis, you know, just like the Amerindians. They used to use cannabis for different purposes. They use cannabis for healing, for pain relief, for spiritual upliftment, and just, you know, during time of peace treaties, that's when most of their cannabis used to be used. So we still enjoy those type of usage and preservation of how cannabis in this time is used. Improving on our regenerative skills by going deeper into how to create and use naturally derived growth elements. Well, we think of the cannabis as something special, something really special to everything that we can enjoy. And this makes us who we are. This makes us some of the carrier, the precious carriers of this industry, of what ganja really is in this time. We keep this alive for many years. So it is our sacrament, and it is real to us, and we are real to it. So we honor it in many ways. And we give thanks to those people out there who do the same. We give thanks, you know, for those people who are bringing on these traditions of cannabis and healing. I hope, you know, I'm not being, you know, too much talkative. I guess the panel, the program is almost over by now. But I give thanks, you know, even to join at this late stage. The time is a little bit different. I saw 1:30 to 2:30 on my time slate. So, you know, I was late. I'm sorry, you know.
No, I'm just glad you got to join and close out, you know, this panel. I think we do need to wrap up now, but I did want to end it on, you know, in our conversations for prepping for this panel, you had made a comment of, you know, in your how you view regenerative agriculture, that it is a view towards the future and kind of this stewardship and you know, responsibility of the farmer, which I think is really important and really powerful. And so I just kind of feel like that's a good way of ending our pathways to regenerative agriculture is, you know, by being a regenerative farmer, participating in regenerative practices, you are honoring the past, but also planning and honoring the future. And so with that, I'd like to thank our panelists, Allison Tuhiko and Aras Baya. I guess we have like 30 seconds if any of you guys want to just do a closing thing real quick. Otherwise, thank you everyone for attending, and please reach out if you have any questions. Anyone real quick?
Well, we give thanks. I mean, I guess I'm late, so I have to close out with you know, something really important. I mean, regenerative agriculture is the future, and it is how we can preserve life on this planet. It is how we can go back to our ancient way of eating, or we can preserve self. With all that is happening now, the different diseases and ailments that is happening in the world, this is the answer. How to look deeper within the soil, the earth, that the earth can heal us. We are from the earth. So it's the only elements that the earth creates that can heal us. And there's everything, the fungus, the bacteria, the microbes, and everything else that there is that grows the plant, that will grow us within ourselves.